Chapter 15. I'm sitting here and the view of the Pacific is just spectacular. We're hundreds of feet above sea level and I only wish you can hear what I'm hearing now. It's a Coast Guard helicopter patrolling the shoreline. I live in a very beautiful town, Palos Verdes, and I'm sitting here in my very special place that I don't share with anybody. It's a cliff that I drive to and park and sit on the edge and look for whales and check out the sailboats and watch these helicopters go by. I can even see Catalina from here. It's just beautiful, man, totally beautiful. Peter Criss dictation, 1984. I didn't know California then. All I knew was the Sunset Strip and Hollywood Boulevard. Deb went out to California a month before we moved out and found a place to rent, with an option to buy. It was up on a cliff in Palos Verdes. We had a ginormous living room with a spectacular view of the ocean. There was a small two-seater balcony off the living room. Both our bedroom and the kitchen also overlooked the ocean. If you went up one flight, there was Ginili's room, a guest room where I was going to set up my drums, and a large room for the pool table and all my gold and platinum albums. If you went out the sliding doors, there was a huge deck with a large swimming pool overlooking the ocean. Above us were just cliffs and rocks. This was like a movie star's house. And it was costing us a movie star's salary. We even had an elevator. Other than the occasional king snake in the swimming pool, it was paradise. Eventually I thought I'd start a band and write my book, but first I just wanted to enjoy California, get a tan, sweat, swim in the ocean. For the first year there, I fucked off. We'd go to Deb's parents' house every Sunday for a big family dinner. After a few months out there, I felt like a different man. I was actually mellower. I felt good about Deb. I didn't fear that she was sneaking off and fucking Joe Kelly. We were a tight, knit little family. On Friday afternoons, I'd take my sports car down the hill and rent 4 or 5 movies and bring back a couple of shopping bags filled with Chinese food. I didn't miss playing at all. I was a man of leisure. I woke up and went to sleep with Ginili. In between we'd watch TV. During the commercials, I'd go to the kitchen for a snack and grab Deb's ass. Life was pretty comfortable then. Deb and I didn't have that much in common, so I made an effort to try to get into some of the things that she enjoyed. Deb liked golf, so I started playing. I was a natural at it, and it was something we could do together. I had a funny incident happen to me playing golf. I was in the men's locker room and these black guys came in to play around. They took one look at my long hair and one guy said, "Shoot, I didn't know they allowed women in the men's room." "Yeah, we've all come a long way, brother," I said. When Deb and I got into drinking together, it never worked out so well. We just didn't get along when we got drunk. Even when we were sober, we'd still fight. Not the knock, down, drag, out, bruising and battling fights of our earlier days, but enough to keep you on your toes. After about a year or so of fucking off, I began to get the music itch again. It started when I took Ginili to A&M Studios to visit. They all knew me there and they would let us come in and they would show her all the consoles. By the spring of 1986 I was ready to make a move. I had heard that the group Steppenwolf was looking for a drummer, so I met with their manager, Ron Rainey. It seemed like a good fit for me. They played real steady, Eddie beats, straight, ahead rock and roll. "I'm impressed that the drummer of Kiss would come down for a job with Steppenwolf," Ron said. "But I'll tell you right off the bat, John Kay is no way going to have a drummer bigger than him in the band. He'd go crazy." Apparently Kay was a control freak. Everything was business first, and they toured in a Winnebago that Kay had designed, playing the same reliable places every year. But Ron had gotten a tape from a new group that featured a chick singer named Jane Book. Her husband was in the band, too, and they wrote the songs together. He told me they were looking for a drummer. I went down and listened to them and I thought they were pretty good. Jane was just adorable. She was around 5'6" with unbelievably beautiful legs, the greatest ass, and big pouty lips accentuated by her flaming, red lipstick and framed by long, curly black hair that gave her a gypsy look. She'd have a guitar hanging off her, she couldn't play it for shit, but it looked cool. The husband played bass and he was good looking, and they had this guitarist who was trying to stop drinking so he would smoke all the time, but Jane wouldn't let him smoke in the loft they rented, so he was going crazy. He could play, though. We started playing together, and we sounded great. They had never played with a hard drummer like me, so their light, poppyish sound became heavier. Jane sounded like Chrissy Hind and did all those Chrissy moves, and I liked that since I had a great view of her little ass in front of me all night. Ron got some money for us to do a demo at A&M, and it was like a homecoming for me. The demo came out okay and Ron started shopping it around. They had come up with a name by then. Balls of Fire, which I hated. We kept rehearsing all the time at their downtown loft. It took me an hour and a half to get there from Palos Verdes, that's how dedicated I was to making this thing work. Jane kept telling me that she didn't know who Kiss was, so I invited her and her husband to my house. I showed them all the gold and platinum and they were in shock. "Wow, you guys sold a lot of records," she said. "Yeah, we were a pretty big band," I admitted. "Were you bigger than the Bay City Rollers?" she asked. I wanted to take a straight razor and cut my wrists. How could she be that stupid? Now I was pissed. We went into the kitchen and I was feeling disrespected. "By the way, if we get a record deal, I want 50% of everything. We'll get a deal because of my name, so I want the lion's share," I said. They went crazy and told me they wouldn't give me any percentage of the band. I told them I would quit. We finally decided to let Ron figure it out. By then Ron had sent Atlantic the demo and they liked it. So he set up a showcase for us at the Whiskey A Go Go where all the Atlantic execs could come down and hear us live. I couldn't believe that I was doing the Whiskey after headlining Madison Square Garden, but I thought, what the fuck? The Doors played there. That night, the whole place filled up with Kiss fans wearing either black Kiss T-shirts or Peter Criss T-shirts. We were in the dressing room, oblivious to all this, when Ron came in. "The Atlantic guys are all out there," he reported. "Plus a lot of Kiss fans." "How many of them?" Jane asked. "Pretty much the whole audience is Kiss fans," he admitted. "Are you kidding me?" she moaned. "It doesn't matter," her husband said. "When we go out there, they'll go crazy." "Absolutely. For me," I said. "See, that's why I want 50%. "Whatever," she said. Finally it was time to play. We walked out there and the audience started chanting, "Peter! Peter! Peter!" She started counting off the count but none of us could hear it, the crowd was making so much noise. We started the song and she was standing right in front of me and someone yelled out, "Get the fuck out of the way. We can't see Peter." Then the audience started chanting, "Get out of the way. Get out of the way. We want Peter. We want Peter." Jane went ballistic. "If you fucking want to see him, here he is," she screamed, and she smashed her guitar on the stage and walked off. "Get the fuck off," someone screamed back, and then everyone started requesting the songs I sang in Kiss. Her husband dropped his head, put his bass down, and left the stage, followed by the guitarist. I came around from the back of the drums to the front of the stage, blew some kisses, and then I left too. The guys from Atlantic walked out, and that was the end of Balls of Fire. I enjoyed being on stage again, however short, lived it was. And it was time to start making some money. We were living off the proceeds of the sale of the house because Kiss had stopped paying me. When I relinquished my 25% share of the partnership assets, I never realized that the character and makeup I created was part of that agreement. Later, this would become a bone of contention. So that was the end of the revenue stream from Kiss. Still, I never paid attention to my finances. Deb had total charge of that. My best friend, Eddie Mulvihill, was always telling me that he was convinced that Deb was siphoning off my money, especially after we got taken for that 25 grand by Louis. Eddie always had my back. He was my Rottweiler, just like Sean Delaney used to be. Eddie worried more about my money than I did. He told me that they would do blow together and she'd bitch and bitch about losing 10 grand of her own money in that deal. That cocksucker idiot, he told me she said. I lost my own personal money. I should start opening up my own bank account. I never thought too much of it until I saw that she started getting statements from a bank that wasn't our neighborhood bank. I could never know if Deb was ripping me off. When we needed money back in New York, we'd just go to the office and ask for some and they'd open up a big leather bag, give you 3 or 5 or 10 grand, and make you sign a receipt for it. She could have easily done that and stashed some of it away. One thing I did know, we weren't going to be able to keep on paying an exorbitant rent if we didn't start making some money. You know, sometimes you can get real scared, you think you're lost and you think it's over, man, and you figure the glory days are gone. And now I face the pressures of everyday living that I never knew about. Being in Kiss, it was always taken care of for me. Now that I'm a parent of a 5-year-old girl, I find that the stress is enormous. Sometimes I freak out at night and go out on my balcony, look out over the ocean, and say, man, is it over? Do I still have it? Am I too old? I guess every man must ask himself these questions when he's struggling to get back on top of something he succeeded at. I want to make money and enjoy playing music at the same time. I get scared, man, I think maybe it's not going to happen for me again. I've got a young wife, I know she loves me, but I just get scared. All I know about is drums. Man, that's all I've ever known and that's what I do the best. You know, in sports when you're a young, tough jock, you can do a lot of moves. When you get older, you can't do those moves. That's what happens to us in music too, especially drummers, it's such a physical instrument. But I am a survivor. I am a survivor. Peter Criss dictation, 1986. After the Balls of Fire fiasco, I couldn't get anything going for the next 2 years. In 1987 I did get a chance to play with my old pal Ace, though. By then I had really assimilated into California and I had grown my hair long and dyed it blonde. I don't know why Deb hadn't intervened and said, "You're Italian, are you out of your mind? There are no blonde Italians." I actually thought I looked great. Don't forget it was the 80s, the hair band days. Ace called me up and told me that he was going to play in El with his group Frelly's Comet. And he wanted me to come down and jam. I brought Ginili with me and we had a great time. Ace's band played a great set and on the final encore, he announced, "I have a really good friend who I called up and he said he'd love to come down and he's here tonight. Peter Criss." I came out and the audience went crazy. I walked out with my blonde hair and a black tank top, tight black leather pants, and my high tops. I waved and then got behind the drums and we played deuce. It was a home run. Playing with Ace whetted my appetite. In 1989 I hooked up with a guitar player named Mark ST. John. Mark had a short tenure in Kiss, but they had crippled him to the point where he couldn't play anymore. He had played on Animalize, and by then Gene and Paul weren't talking to each other. So Gene had booked studio time in one studio and Paul was recording his songs at another place. Paul would call Mark to come by to record and he'd get there and Paul would be there with the producer and the engineer. Paul would tell him what to play and Mark would go into his Eddie Van Halen shit because that's how Mark played, much too busy. He'd work with Paul for 6 hours. Then Gene would call and have him come to his studio, where he'd work him for another 6 hours. Mark told me that he would have to go home and put his hands in ice because he couldn't move his fingers. When they went on tour, his hands failed him during the first show and they fired him. He went to a doctor and the doctor said that he had worn out his cartilage. I thought working with the former guitarist of Kiss would surely make Gene and Paul crazy, but it made me crazy. I'd go to his house to rehearse and half the time he'd have overslept. One time the door to his room was open and I found kitty porn magazines from Germany all over the floor. It was really sick shit. This wasn't Ace jerking off to a poster, this was way beyond that. When we recorded some demos with a singer we picked up, Mark came to my hotel room the night before at 3 a.m. with a cheap hooker and asked me to hold his 8-ball of coke. After he left, I flushed the coke down the toilet. I was furious. It cost me thousands of dollars to pay for the demos and they were a disaster. We never came close to getting a deal. Around the same time, I decided I wanted to write my memoir. I hooked up with some publishing company on Sunset Boulevard near A&M Studios. I told the head honcho there my tales of woe and all the crazy Kiss stories and he thought it would make a great book. They kept sending ghost writers over to my house to work with me and that was a disaster, too. So I drove down to Big Bear and got a cabin and started dictating my story. I'd give them the tapes and the writers would come back with something that had nothing to do with what I said. I'm a Brooklyn kid, I talk with a certain syntax, and these guys were just fabricating a different Peter Criss. So I dropped that idea. By the end of the 80s, Deb and I had to downsize once again. One day Deb came to me and told me that the realtor said it was insane that we were paying so much in rent and that it would be prudent to buy something. So we put down a chunk of money and bought a brand new townhouse in Redondo Beach. It was spacious enough to house my pool table and all my records, and we had a nice private backyard. We had a big sun deck and a storage area that I converted into a makeshift studio. But it was Redondo Beach. It wasn't Palos Verdes, it wasn't Beverly Hills, it wasn't even Manhattan Beach, which was much more expensive. One good thing about being in Redondo was that I got totally into biking. I had dabbled with it in Palos Verdes, but now I got serious. I bought a custom-made bike and I'd get up at 4 a.m. and ride along the coast from Redondo all the way to Malibu and back. I was never in better shape. My leg muscles were like steel. Riding was a great natural high and it was always fun to ride past all those beautiful California girls in their skimpy little bikinis. I'd come home really horny after a ride and jump on Deb. I figured I'd get a band together, and Deb thought about going back to modeling, doing some catalog work. That was the plan. Deb tried to get bookings but it wasn't happening, so she started a gourmet basket business out of our garage. She'd take imported salamis and cheeses and mustards and spruce them up in a nice basket and sell them. That should have been my tip. Off that money was running out. My relationship with Deb was as flat as my career at that point. I really loved her, but I didn't think she really loved me. Sure, she loved me when we were living in a mansion and we had money up the ass. But now she was pushing 30 and she realized the party might be over. We never had a deep relationship. We never made a spiritual connection. We never talked about our feelings. But we still were able to regularly push each other's buttons and fight. I remember we were sitting in the car one night. Nothing seemed to be going on musically for me, and she turned on the little light over the dashboard and said, That's the last fucking spotlight you'll ever have. I was just crushed. That only made me double my efforts to get a band together. A guitarist friend of mine put me in touch with a Canadian songwriter named Phil Narrow. I got his demo and it blew my socks off. He was a great writer, and he hit the notes with the kind of clarity Steve Perry had. Phil told me that Gene and Paul were hip to him and Paul wanted to write with him. I convinced him to come down to Redondo and write with me instead. When he got there, I think he was a little bit uncomfortable with me smoking the occasional joint. He was a born, again Christian, and he didn't do any drugs at all. I don't think he liked being away from his wife and newborn kid because he was calling her all the time. But I started cracking the whip, and we wrote every day. It was like having Stan Penridge around again, but better. This guy could sing like an angel. Now I didn't have to be the lead singer. I could still do Hard Luck Woman and Beth and Black Diamond, but he could sing the new songs we were writing. Part of my urgency to write stuff and get the band together was thanks to a little letter we had received from the IRS. Apparently some of the tax shelters that Marks and Glickman put us in when I was with Kiss were bogus, and now we were all on the line for $1 million in back taxes. Of course I didn't have nearly enough money to pay it off, so we decided to find a tax attorney who could represent us. Deb had met this fat woman named Maureen, whose kid went to the same school as Jean-Eiley. Maureen's kid was a troublemaker and was always getting Jean-Eiley into trouble. I guess the apple didn't fall far from the tree. Maureen's husband was in prison. Maureen worked at a big law firm that did a lot of environmental work, and she recommended that we go see a guy named Bob Mac McMurray. We met with Mac in his office in Santa Monica. He was a typical lawyer, tall, blue eyes, dressed suave, a lot of confidence. He promised to refer us to a tax guy, and he also said he could help me with my music career. With the IRS hanging over our heads, Deb got a job as a perfume girl at Nordstrom. The gourmet, basket business had gone to hell and she was getting nervous about our money situation. Eventually she worked her way up to salesperson, but it was still a far cry from being a lady of leisure in Darien. As if things couldn't get any worse, I found out that my mother was sick. I flew back to New York and went with her to see her doctor the next day. After her examination, I asked if I could see the doctor in private. My mother was furious. We went into a nearby room and the doctor broke the news to me that my mother had cancer. It had started as lung cancer, but it had progressed to her bones. Now they wanted her to do chemotherapy. I came back out shaken. On the way home, my mother gave it to me. "You son of a bitch, what was that about? Now you're MR. Big shot, you've got to talk to the doctor alone and find out what's wrong with me. I know what's wrong with me. I have cancer and it's a reality and I'm not happy about it." She had really changed. She was angry and bitter about her fate. She was only 62, but she had smoked Pall Malls all her life and never really followed through on follow-up visits to doctors. But now she was going to get chemotherapy, so I went back to California. I called home every so often and my sisters would tell me that Mom was doing okay, so I thought things were under control. Then, on New Year's Day 1991, I got a call from my brother. "You better come home, Ma's dying." I was devastated. I hung up and called a travel agent. I had to take 3 planes to get to New York. I drank all the bars out on each flight and I still couldn't get drunk. I was so sick to my stomach. Did my wife come with me? No. I took these horrible flights alone, rushing home to see my mother die, because Deb came up with some excuse not to go. I finally got into the city 5 hours later than scheduled. I rushed right to the house. They had an apartment at the back of their antique store. I knocked on the door and my dad opened it. He had his head down and I walked into the room and I looked over and my mother's bed was empty. The sheets were all made up. I sat down on the bed. She passed on 5 hours ago. There was a blue moon out and it was shining on her face through the window of her room and she looked like an angel, my dad said. Maybe you were blessed that you weren't here, my brother, Joey, said. You wouldn't have recognized her. My mother was a big Irish, German woman, but she was down to 60 pounds when she died. Despite what Joey said, I was crushed that I never got that chance to say goodbye and tell her how much I loved her. I sat on her bed and felt a huge wave of guilt wash over me. I was too late to hold her hand, too late to kiss her goodbye. Sure, I had been wrapped up in my problems with the IRS and trying to start a band and a rapidly deteriorating relationship with my wife. But now the closest person in my world was gone. How could I have fucked up like this? I didn't have millions anymore, but I had some money. I should have rented an apartment in the neighborhood or even slept on my parents' couch so I could be there for her. It took me a couple of psychiatrists and a couple of good benders to accept the fact that I didn't fuck up. I should have, could have, would have, but it was too late. So now was I supposed to carry a cross forever? My mother would never have wanted that. She always understood me. She was always my pal. I stayed in Brooklyn and we made all the arrangements for the funeral. I called Deb and broke the news to her and asked her if she could come out as soon as possible. She gave me some shit about something that she was doing in LA. When I asked her to bring me a pair of my dress shoes for the funeral, she told me to buy some new ones. And when she finally came out, she was a day late. We had a 3-day wake for my mom. They were 3 of the worst days you'd ever want to have in your life. I was the oldest son, so I greeted all the people at the door so my dad wouldn't have to. I had to sit there all day looking at my poor mother in the casket. That was the last time that I went to an open casket funeral. Deb came on the second day and I felt no sympathy at all from her. It was clear that she wasn't in love with me anymore. Her hugs were fake, her tears were fake, it was all a show. I hardly made it through the burial. I was in a state of shock the whole week. That was why it barely registered that there were reporters hanging around outside the funeral parlor. When I came in or out, they would ask me crazy questions like, what's it like to sleep in the toilets of Santa Monica? I just thought they were there because I had been in Kiss. My father even got a call from a journalist who asked him, is it true that your son is a bum, sleeping in the streets? My father went crazy and hung up on the guy. But when I got back home, I got a very disturbing phone call from John Good, the vice president of DW, my new drum company. They were just starting out and I was only the 3rd drummer to sign with them, but I really liked them, and John and I had become close friends. John sounded concerned. Peter, are you okay? I'm fucking far from being okay, John, I said. Well, it's all over all the tabloids, he said. What's all over? They say you're totally broke and you're sleeping in the toilets of Santa Monica, he said. What are you talking about? You're on the phone with me in Redondo. I just got back from New York, where I buried my mother. He was confused. He didn't know anything about my mother, he just knew that his office was fielding a ton of calls from fans who were concerned that I was a homeless bum in the streets of Santa Monica because they read about it in Star magazine, and then all the other tabloids picked the story up. Peter, I'm so sorry. I guess you haven't read the papers. They wrote that you had burned through all your millions and you were homeless now. I would look into it when you're feeling up to it. I checked it right out and I was blown away. There was a photo of some bum who was claiming to be me lying in the toilets in Santa Monica, and next to it was a photo of me in my Kiss makeup. I was furious. But it got worse. Tom Arnold and Roseanne Barr, who were big fans of mine, were scouring the downtown area of Los Angeles, looking for me on Skid Row. Deb and I decided we had to sue the tabloid that was putting out this phony story, so we went back to Mac, the lawyer who was helping us out when the IRS got on our case. Mac said he had the perfect lawyers who would sue Star Magazine and get us a big settlement. While we were waiting to see the lawyers about suing the tabloids, Mac got a call from the Phil Donahue show. They wanted me to come on and talk about having an imposter pose as me. Mac was convinced that it would be a good thing to show to the world that the story was bogus, so we agreed to do the program. I had second thoughts. I looked like shit. My hair was still blonde, I had put on a few pounds from drinking so much, and I was zoned out on tranquilizers because I was so out of it from losing my mom. I was literally anesthetizing myself morning, noon, and night over it. On top of that, add the IRS problem and the fact that I was getting that vibe from Deb that things weren't really copacetic with us. But Mac was putting the pressure on and Deb wanted to go because it meant first class everything, so I agreed. I just wanted it all to go away, I was so hurt. We got to New York and they brought us to the studio. They hid us backstage and put the imposter, a guy named Christopher Dickinson, on first. Phil was asking him how he could run around impersonating me, didn't he have any remorse for causing me all these problems? The guy was a total alcoholic maniac and he didn't seem to care at all how any of this affected my life. To make matters worse, they had a girl and her mother who had flown this guy out to her house and let him live there for a week, thinking he was me. Next thing you know, Phil said, "Well, we have the real Peter Criss here, and we're going to bring him out now." I came walking out, and they all looked at me in shock. "You know, you made my life a living hell," I told the guy. "You made me sick and my mother just passed. How dare you?" Out of nowhere the chick says that I, the real Peter Criss, screwed her. She said that she had heard that I was homeless and she flew this guy out to her house, but that when he got there she realized he wasn't me. But now that I was here, she claimed that she had an affair with me. I was ready to kill someone at this point. "My wife is here," I said. "Can my wife stand up?" For a second, Deb stood up. She looked really classy and beautiful. "Look at her and look at you," I said to the girl. "Do you really think that I would sleep with you after I married someone like that? You're a pig." The audience went crazy. Phil started taking live phone calls, and Lydia and my ex, road manager George Swit, called and both vouched for my character. That was nice of them. When the taping was over, I went over to Dickinson. "Are you happy about what you did to my life, you fuck?" I said. We were backstage in the dressing room getting ready to leave when Donahue came in. "I feel really bad for this guy," he told me. "Why don't you and I both throw in $1,000 and we'll give it to him?" "Fuck you," I told Donahue. "You want me to give him money after he made my life a living hell?" Donahue left the room. I was infuriated. What a jerk. Later on I found out that this Dickinson guy was crazy. He was going all around L.A. impersonating me, booking time at A&M Studios, ordering limos under my name. But I couldn't even get satisfaction from outing this guy. I was in such profound pain over the loss of my mother. Everything that was said to me I heard 3 times. It was like I was experiencing life behind a smoky mirror. Meanwhile we had a lawsuit to pursue. These young lawyers that Mac found for us were great. They arranged for People magazine to come to my house and do a photo spread to show I wasn't homeless. We did mock trials. They put together big blow-ups of photographs of the imposter and me side by side. They were convinced that we would kill Star magazine at trial. We never even got into the courtroom. We met their lawyers in the hallway and the 2 sides talked. My lawyers came back to where we were standing. They want to give you a substantial amount of money and we're out of here. Or we could go to court. It might be costly, but I think we'll win. That's why they're making such a generous offer, my lawyer said. He strongly suggested I take the money and run, so I did. That little bit of good news was overshadowed by the news I got from Bill Dooley, a nice engineer at the record plant who had felt sorry for me and given me free time when Mark ST. John was running up my bill in the studio. I invited him and his wife to dinner at our house. We also had Mac, the lawyer, there because he was divorced then and it would be nice for him to have a home-cooked meal. The next day, I saw Dooley in the studio and he looked a little squeamish. "Can I tell you something, Peter?" he said. "It's really uncomfortable, but I feel close enough to you that we can talk about it." "What?" "My wife says that your wife is fucking that lawyer that we had dinner with last night." "Get the fuck out of here, Bill," I protested. "I love you, man, and you've been through a lot with your mom and the tabloid shit, but you have to know this. My wife saw them making out in the kitchen while we all were shooting pool." I didn't want to believe Bill, but deep down I knew he was right. I had felt those vibes for months. It certainly explained why Deb wasn't with me on that flight to see my dying mother. She was too busy back in Redondo fucking Mac. Now that I was back in L.A., I redoubled my efforts to put together a band. I really wanted to get on the road and escape the hell that my life had turned into. It was really hard on Phil Nero to get comfortable with us and the daily arguments Deb and I were having. Plus he might as well have been a male version of Beth, calling his wife every 15 minutes. He stayed with us a little while longer and we wrote a beautiful song about my mother dying called Blue Moon Over Brooklyn. The demos we did were good, and I wanted to take a band out on the road, but he freaked out. He wanted to get back to his wife and kid. I really liked Phil. He was great but it just didn't work out. I was getting all these musicians through my friend Bob. I had met Bob when I was still living in Palos Verde. Bob sold the best fucking marijuana in the world out of his small mobile home. We became incredibly close, and Bob wound up just giving me all the pot I needed. In return, I let him hook his camper up to my electricity source. I'm sure the neighbors loved that. Bob was a real authentic granola-loving hippie who introduced me to a Spanish guitar player named Ray Carrion, who brought in a bass player named Mark Montague. And along with Phil Nero, the first incarnation of Criss was born. When Phil split, we replaced him with a singer named Philip Anthony. I rented out a little rehearsal space in Redondo for $20 a day and we rehearsed our asses off. All the guys had day jobs because I didn't have the money to pay them. I was riding on my fame just to convince them to join the band. When it got too rough and someone wanted to quit, Bob would bring them pot, and these guys were just pure weed heads, no coke, no pills, so that convinced them to stick around. They were all hungry to make it. We did a couple of shows in November of 1991 at the Exposure 54 Club in downtown L.A. To me it was atrocious to be back in a club, but these guys were flying on cloud nine because they were on stage with a famous person. They all bought special clothes and made their hair up all chicky and we got a great response. It was enough to make me get an agent and start touring. But we still couldn't get a record deal. We floated the demo around to Geffen first, but they were like, no way. Then we took it all around town but we got shot down everywhere. The record industry had jumped on the grunge bandwagon, and that wasn't my kind of music. It wasn't rock and roll. None of the guys could believe that we couldn't get a deal, but it wasn't like Kiss was doing so well themselves at this point. They were on the balls of their asses, losing money left and right. Meanwhile things just seemed to be deteriorating with Deb. I still hadn't confronted her with the news I had heard about Mac. We were fighting a lot about the most trivial things. I noticed that she was a little more cynical and a little more cocky than usual. That was probably because she had a rich lawyer waiting in the wings. So after one fight, I decided to bluff her. "I'm going to move out and take my gold records," I told her. "Fine, take them and go," she said. She was so cold. We'd say shit like that and then we'd make up. But not this time. We got into another fight, and I repeated my threat. I started taking my records down off the wall, but instead of stopping me, she didn't say a word. In fact, she even took me to Hollywood and helped me pick out a place to live. So all of a sudden, we were getting separated. "I don't want to live with you anymore," she said. And then she told me all about Mac. I can't remember the exact words, because hearing them was so devastating my brain went blank. But the gist of it was that she was seeing Mac and she wanted a divorce. I was miserable living alone in Hollywood. My friend Bob the hippie thought that he would cheer me up by setting me up with a skinny little rat blonde who had done some porno films. We talked a few times on the phone, some hot, nasty talk, and then one night I answered the phone and it was her. "I'm downstairs in front of your place. Why don't you come down and get me?" she said. I was lonely and I figured I'd check her out at least. She was sitting downstairs, and she actually looked pretty good. So I brought her up to the apartment. Nothing happened that night, we just talked, but I saw her another time and she came to a rehearsal. That day I took her back upstairs and we tried to get it on in bed. We used to do a thing in Kiss called the reach around. When you're making out with a girl, you stick your finger in her pussy, move it around a bit, and then, while you're still in front of her making out, you surreptitiously take a whiff of your finger. If there was no odor, she'd pass the finger test. But if she smelled funky, there was no fucking. Well, this chick did not pass the test. She was definitely a whoa. So we got into bed and started fooling around and I couldn't really get it up. The whole thing was too depressing. But at one point I get semi-hard and I got as far as putting the head of my dick in her pussy before I freaked out about catching something from her. Later I obsessed about it and felt like my dick needed to have a year of not being touched because I went into the most unholiest hole in L.A. A few weeks later, I took Deb and Jeannie out for dinner at Benihana. We had a few of those crazy Mai Tais, so Deb got a bit of a buzz on. I dropped them back at the townhouse in Redondo and I got out of my new Eddie Bauer truck to say goodbye and Deb told me to wait there. She and Jeannie just wanted to get out of their clothes. Well, Jeannie didn't return, but Deb came back in a see-through nightgown. The truck was in a carport and Deb led me to the back of it where nobody could see in and she opened her nightgown and she was naked and she grabbed me and wanted to fuck right there on the truck. I would have, but it suddenly hit me that I had been with that rat tramp a week before. The last thing I wanted to do was give Deb some disease. I did have class. "We can't do this. We're separated," I protested, but I didn't tell her the real reason I was holding back. "Go to hell," she said, and tightened her robe and stormed off. Then my daughter came out and said good night to me. And my shot of ever fucking Deb again was over. Of course, I had no disease, it was all in my head. I should have thrown her over the truck and given her the fuck of the century, but I didn't. A week after that, Deb called me and begged me to come over. I got there and I had never seen her so distraught. "Mac broke up with me," she was crying. "He dumped me and I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm so in love with him." I was sitting there like, should I shoot her or just throw her through the window? My heart was breaking and she was going on about this schmuck dumping her. But as much as I was pissed off, if she would have said, "Come back to me," I would have. I was that stupid and still in love with her. Of course, a couple of weeks later, they got back together. It was only a matter of time until I got served papers. Deb's fat friend Maureen, who introduced us to Mac, came by my apartment one day with her kid and Jeannie. I opened the door and she handed me some papers. "What's this?" I asked. "Read it," she said, and stood there gloating. I should have punched her right in her fat fucking face. I didn't look at the papers, but I had an idea. "No, you've got to read them and see what they are," she said. She just wanted to see my expression. "I'll read them later." "No, I have to wait." "Deborah told me," she said. So I pulled them out of the envelope and it said, "You are hereby served that Deborah Criss is filing for a divorce." She broke out into a shit-eating grin. I just slammed the door on all three of them. Then I sat down at my kitchen table and just stared at the papers. This was it. The end of the line. The reality just slapped me in the face. I had always harbored the fantasy that maybe Deb and I would get back together. Sometimes I'd call her mother. Betty, Deb's mom, and I got along great. I really felt she loved me. She'd say, "You guys may get back together. She's seeing this guy, but who knows?" When I got the papers, it was the death knell to that idea. I had put 13 years of my life into that relationship and now I had nothing. It went further than the money, it was devastation. My family was now officially shattered. The white, picket, fence life was forever over. I sat down at the table at 3 in the afternoon just staring a hole in those papers, and when I finally looked up at the clock, it was 3 in the morning. I don't know where all those hours went. While we figured out the divorce, I got to see Jeannie every weekend and on holidays and birthdays. Saturday morning was like Christmas for me. I'd wake up elated and then pick her up like clockwork and take her to Disneyland or to the park. We'd eat Chinese food and rent spooky movies and then I'd bring her back Sunday night. Driving home alone after dropping Jeannie off was pure hell. I would play sad music and cry all the way home. By now my settlement with Star magazine was finalized. Out of the settlement I had to pay my lawyers and Deb's portion of the IRS bill and then hire a divorce lawyer to represent me. So I wound up with $100 grand. Oh, and I was also supposed to give Mac a $35,000 finder's fee, but he got nothing. He was fucking my wife and I'm going to give him money too. By then I had a booking agent and we lined up a tour of Canada. Mark the bass player, whom I nicknamed Tall Man, found us a funky bus and we were off. After a few dates I realized that Ray was driving me crazy. He was a great guitar player, but he was one of those Spanish guys who would preen around with his hair in a net, totally in love with himself. He thought he was running the band, so Mark and I decided it was time for him to go. I like Ray but he just got crazy. By 1993 I scored a record deal with TNT Records, a small label out of LA. By then the band was me and Mark from the original lineup and a new singer named Mike Stone and a guitar player named Kirk Miller. We had 4 good original songs and a nice new version of Beth, so I convinced the label to put out an EP that would only be available to Kiss fans. I figured this was a way to say to the fans, "I'm back and I love you and only you the Kiss fans can get this ain't for the public." It was a way to promote the upcoming CD, and we got a great response. With the band I was trying to get my mind off the breakup of my marriage, but it didn't really work out that way. When I was on the road I desperately missed Jeannie and then all my mixed emotions about Deb would surface. In fact, I hadn't really had another woman since that disastrous encounter with the rug rat. But one night while I was on tour in Canada, I met this chick who was nothing like the type of woman I had ever been with. Her name was Maggie and she was short and heavy with big tits, a big ass, and piano legs, cute but a lot less attractive than most of the women I'd been with. She was only 21, but her sexual experience belied both her years and her appearance. She came backstage one night and we were making out, and I just thought there was something sensuous about this young farm girl with glasses. That night we went back to my hotel and I learned that you can't judge a book by its cover. She was an absolute perfect 10 in bed. She was unbelievable. We fucked all night long and eureka! The spoiler was back. I got on the bus the next morning and I was grinning like a Cheshire cat. "Good morning, gentlemen," I said. "I'm never like that, I'm a nasty bastard in the morning." But I felt good again. I had finally gotten laid after a year, and it felt great. Maggie made me appreciate sex again. She showed up at the next venue and the show after that, and it was great. Eventually we left Canada and we would call each other on the phone and have hot phone sex. On a hiatus from the tour, she invited me up to her parents' place in Canada. It was summertime, they had a big house on a lake, and I met her parents and I liked them. Canadians are pretty crazy. We just spent the whole day screwing in the guest house and screwing in the canoe. This girl couldn't screw enough, she was 21. I was going through a midlife crisis, so I wasn't complaining. Before I knew it, I was asking this young girl to move into my apartment in Hollywood. It wasn't easy. We had to clear a lot of hurdles with immigration, but I moved her in. In retrospect, I probably should have had my head examined for doing this. I liked her at first because she was open and bubbly and wild, and I was really, really lonely. But after a few months, whatever we had going on the road or at that cabin or in that canoe wasn't there anymore. Every night she just wanted sex, 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 and after a while I got burned out on it. We had nothing else in common, our age difference was too great. I started going crazy, and I told her that she had to move back home. "What? You gotta go back. I'll pay for everything, but you gotta get on a plane and go home. I don't want to be with you anymore." It was horrifying. She cried all the way to the airport. She was hanging on me screaming going through the terminal, and she cried while she was getting on the plane. I felt bad. She was always nice to me, but I just couldn't take living with her any longer. I was alone again in my shitty little apartment in Hollywood. I briefly had a new girlfriend, but she paled in comparison to my ex. I had hit the road again, but I was playing small clubs instead of huge stadiums. I still hadn't fully gotten over the loss of my mom 3 years earlier, and my father didn't seem to have the will to continue without his life mate. It was truly the worst of times. And then I felt the tremors and the walls came tumbling down.